at a very fundamental level, people depend on ecosystems for things that we take for granted, for the energy that comes from the sun, for nutrient cycling, for the water cycle. And those are very hard to put a number on because they're so fundamental to our way of life that we just wouldn't be here without them. But when we think about some of the other things that ecosystems provide to us, where we can put a value on them, things like the role of ecosystems in drawing down and storing carbon, the role of pollinators, the role of ecosystems in producing timber or other kinds of fibres and food, then we can show that intact ecosystems are probably 100 times or more the value to society than many of our transformed ecosystems. So by allowing biodiversity loss to continue and not taking that value of ecosystems into account, we're squandering a lot of the natural value of the world's ecosystems. And that's why we have to take biodiversity loss and ecosystem change much more seriously than we have in the past. So when I first started working in conservation about 25 years ago, there were some rather vague rules that determined whether species were listed as being at risk of extinction. Essentially, experts just decided whether or not a species was at risk. And that became a problem when more and more people were nominating species, and they were nominating species of very different kinds. And we developed a set of scientifically based criteria based on ecological principles and population biology, whereby we were able to identify thresholds in population size or species range area, rates of decline, extent of fragmentation, these kind of features of natural populations that would determine their relative risk of extinction. And over the course of time, we've been able to refine those principles into a set of scientifically based quantitative criteria that determine the species that go on IUCN's Red List. And that Red List has now been applied, or the criteria that we developed for the Red List have now been applied to around 90,000 species worldwide, and gives us a priority list for species at highest risk of extinction. So I think the first thing that we need to do is to set some more ambitious targets to recover biodiversity. So the ongoing decline has probably left us with a planet that's depleted of biodiversity relative to what we need. So we need some targets to recover and restore intact biodiversity. And probably the priorities there is firstly to re-establish forests and green areas generally, both for carbon storage and for hazard protection, but also to find ways that we can do food production and agriculture sufficient to feed the world's people without continuing to degrade biodiversity. So these policies in line with climate change and food production are really important.